and today is the 25th of April, 1984. I'm in Vancouver at the UBC School of Social Work. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Jimmy Sadler. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Mr. Sadler, in order to get started, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your early life.
Yes, I was born in Montreal, Quebec, in March 1914, and lived in Montreal until I was about age 7 or 8, when we moved to BC, to Penticton, and lived in Penticton, then Beachland, Armstrong, and then Vancouver. And in Vancouver, I finished high school, went on to university. Started UBC in 1932, and was enrolled in agriculture. I took my degree in 1936, a BSc in agriculture. But 2 years before graduation, I became interested in what was happening in the social work field. It was just not just like economics that intrigued me, but it was the social work aspect of what was happening to people in the Depression. That led me off to questions as to was there something that could be done in connection with agriculture and in social work. So when I graduated, I went on to postgraduate, and in those days, it was a diploma. And I had to pick up extra courses, so I went to summer school in 1936. Took social work in the winter of 37, that would be. Then a summer school, and then went to work for the BC government.
When you were here at the School of Social Work at UBC, what kinds of courses did you have?
It was a rounded experience as far as the courses were concerned. We had, I suppose you could call it everything from the sociological aspects to the economic aspects of what was happening. And I think that the Dr. Cassidy at the time was trying to give us a rounded picture of what we were facing and what was happening in Canada. And in that way, he was trying to prepare us to go out and look at a broad sense. It was only in 1935, I think, that the Social Security bill had passed in the States, which was a major step, as you know. And he was using that as a basis of what could happen in Social Security and what definitely was needed in Canada, and not just relief programs. And the courses were geared to make us think as to how all these combinations could be brought together. And that's pretty well the background of the school.
Mm-hmm.
It was extremely interesting.
Do you have a recollection about other people who were teaching courses at the time?
I can't recall names offhand. Dr. Topping, of course, he took the criminal and criminology end and did the lectures in institutional care. The school brought in people such as Jim Creighton, who was head of at that time, I think it was called the Old Age Pension Board. He was an ex-school teacher, and he lectured on the needs of the aged. We had Mary McFedrin, who was head of the Family Service Agency, and she came in and lectured on the straight family aspect of social work. Mary King came in and she talked about what allowances meant to mothers with children. And that was really the beginning, or had been the beginning, of mother's allowance in Canada, which was passed in 1927. We had 2 or 3 people that came in and talked to us, I suppose, on the series of what could happen in compensating people who were hurt. It was a great flux at the time. Compensation, costs of maintaining people who were injured on the job, and what this meant in the social aspect.
Mhm.
And those people came in. So by and large, it was a pretty well-rounded program.
Did you do a field placement?
Did a field placement I did a couple. The one in the summer was at the venereal disease clinic at the General Hospital. This was part of the public health program of BC. And my project that summer was to review all the registration cards of everyone that had been registered at a clinic in BC with any type of venereal disease. The first thing I did was run a count on the cards, and there were 54,000. So I felt that there was going to be no follow-up in 8 weeks. So what way I was assigned to was the social work under Ursula Whitehead, who was an extremely fine person, to try and locate the vulnerable group in that, the mothers, the children. And I went out on research on that.
Mm-hmm.
That program actually was carried on long after I left as a student. They did the reviews.
Mm-hmm. So you had a research
Yes.
placement in a sense.
That's right.
And your second placement?
Was with the Family Welfare Bureau, it was called in that time. And that was a winter placement. And I ended up with a caseload in Vancouver, which was extremely interesting. It was a group of families that were actually not so dependent financially, but they were disintegrating in the face of sheer neighborhood pressure. And it was in the East End. And there was a flux, a movement of population. Kids were, I guess, not getting too much supervision. And the pressures, I guess, within the family itself was beginning to tell.
What kind of pressures would the neighborhood put on the families?
Well, I think it was some economic, but mainly people who had drifted from outside the city and had come into the city, and as their low-income group of people, by the way. Not necessarily on relief, though. And as they drifted in, they drifted to the low-rent areas. Their standards, their community standards, they left behind. Small town, everybody knew everybody else. You did maintain some kind of a standard, I suppose. When they got into these areas, the community knowledge of each other seemed to have gone, and they seemed to be having problems adjusting. I think it was just adjustment problems, actually.
Mm-hmm.
We'd look at that today as adjustment problems.
What kind of service did you try to provide to these families?
We were trying to provide just a straight casework service, and if there was financial need, then what we did was refer to the city social service, which was the city relief department, which cooperated with the family service agency wholeheartedly. If we came in and said, look, a little financial help here will give a boost to what we're trying to do in stabilizing the internal operation of this family, they'd help.
The city welfare department at that time, what was wrong with that? How did they operate?
It was a separate unit unto itself. It was a shared cost by the city, the province, and the federal government. And a man by the name of Jim Chambers was in charge. Very fine man. With a social conscience. And sometimes in relief agencies you didn't quite find all of that. But you certainly did with him.
When you finished your placement, and you said you started work, was it 1937?
1937.
What was your first job?
I was assigned to the Children's Aid Society on a loan from the province. I went to work for the provincial government, which was the social service section, if you could call it that, was in the provincial secretary's department. And that department had social workers. It was the department that handled the Adoption Act, the aid to destitute people. It was we used to call it the Destitute, Poor and Sick. It was Department of Provincial Secretary. Extra allowances for health. It also handled mother's allowance. And as nearly a separate entity, but under it was the Old Age Pension Board, and it was handled that way. The Relief Department was a separate entity under the Department of Labor, but I went to work under Provincial Secretary. The Provincial Secretary's Department lent me to the Children's Aid Society in Vancouver. And I was doing court work and follow-up work for the Children's Aid Society.
Why had you been alone?
I think the department felt that they wanted to have me get some court experience because they'd assigned me to a place called Prince Rupert, which is on the north coast, where there was no office. So that fall, I left Vancouver and went to Prince Rupert and opened an office there. That would be about the 4th or 5th social welfare office opened in BC, outside the cities, outside of Victoria, outside of Vancouver, Greater Vancouver. At that time, there was an office in Prince George, one in Nanaimo, one in Westminster, one in Chilliwack, and a social worker who used to work from her home in the Okanagan. And the Kootenays, the whole Kootenay area was handled by people from the main office in Vancouver. So there was no service in the Kootenays in the wintertime. My territory covered from, this may not mean too much to you, but from the Queen Charlotte Islands to halfway to Prince George, it's about 600 or 700 miles. And from Ocean Falls in the south to the Yukon border, but actually I never went beyond Telegraph Creek. And the 2 years or so I was in Prince Rupert, the longest I was ever in Prince Rupert was 10 days at a time.
You spent a lot of time
On the road, traveling.
where the road?
No roads,
How
no
did you get around?
train, boat. And the boat people were good. They could go up and down the coast by various steamship lines. I used to ride with the provincial police on their boat. I had, a pass system with a CNR that I could ride their freights. So I could get on a freight and move from place to place. And a pass system that allowed me to ask their station, I don't think you'd call them station agents, they were the foremen in the various areas, to move me from place to place by speeder or handcar, because there were no roads.
What kind of cases were you running into up there?
We had a cross section. Relief was handled by the Department of Labor, so although we worked side by side and very closely and very well, I didn't touch the financial end except for the vote that we used to call DPNS, Department of Provincial Secretary, which was a fund that was used for a group of people who were completely, now I say completely destitute because they really were, from age 65 to 70. The old age pension began at age 70. And we found a group of people that fell outside the relief, which was really supposed to be for work people, and the old age pension. So we had a group of people who, men, and quite a few women in the north, who just had no other means. They had a little cabin, a little place to live. So we had allowances we used to give them. And that was a monthly allowance. And as well, we had mother's allowance, and that was for the woman with the family, the youngsters, under age 18. And we handled that, and it was quite an act. It was on the basis of need. It was on the basis of good conduct and acceptable in the community.
Would you like to define that?
Well, I can't remember it offhand. It's too bad I didn't have a copy. It's an ancient act. But there was a connotation. The woman had to be a good woman. She had to be a good person. She had to be a good mother. I didn't find any that weren't.
That was up to you in your position?
Yes. Well, no, not really. We made an investigation and filled out a form that had 4 to 8 pages. I've forgotten which, but I think it was around 8. Every bit of detail. And that went to the Superintendent of Welfare's office in Victoria, in the Provincial Secretary's Department, where the adjudication was made. I can't think of ever having a recommendation rejected or overturned.
Who was the superintendent at that time?
Yes, Jim Creighton and Mr. Creighton. And his assistant was Mary King. Yes, Mary King. Elizabeth Mary King. We have 2 Mary Kings, and if I mention a Mary King later, I don't want to get them mixed up because at age 1, because one was quite a bit younger than the other.
Thanks for clarifying that for people from far away who might.
But anyway, that too brought us into the Adoption Act. We handled that on the recommendations. Again to the superintendent, but this was the superintendent of child welfare, and that office was in Vancouver, 410 Seymour Street. The adoptions were rather a pleasant part. The people adopting were extremely sincere people who desire for a family. You could not fault too much in your review. And it was nice to be able to place babies instead of having them drift into the institutions. And the institutions were slowly but surely being closed at that time, but we still did have a couple of orphanages. We also handled what was called the Child Welfare Act, covering neglect. It was the Neglected Children's Act. We came in when the police would find abuse of children, neglect of children anyway. They'd contact the department, they'd contact the local office. We'd come in on the basis that we could apprehend and remove the children. We faced difficulty many times in placements. It was easy, the easiest thing in the world, and I'm always intrigued when I see this. People say social workers rush in and apprehend. But the last thing a social worker ever wants to do. And we found that if we had to apprehend, we had 7 days to go to court. It was a matter of placement. Where did we keep a youngster? I was fortunate in Prince Rupert. There had been established a place called the Ridley Home by the Anglican Church. It was really a small institution, extremely small, used for the care of youngsters who were coming and going from Prince Rupert to the various areas on the coast, who came to Rupert to go to school. And they could live there for a while until they found a place. So I could use that. But as the distances were so great, what I had to do was establish foster homes up and down the railroad line and up and down the coast, where if there was trouble and I got a call from the police that they'd picked up 3 youngsters, I could say, take them out to Mrs. So-and-so in Tulpa. Tell her I said so.
Mm-hmm.
And she'll look at it. So really what we did was build up a foster home network outside of any institutional care.
That was a really new concept too, wasn't it?
Very new. And we had to give some pretty detailed information to the community. And I found I had to do this, that it had to be done. And I welcomed it. I'd speak to various organizations and explain why the taxpayer was paying to maintain 2 or 3 youngsters in a home separate from their own, when possibly they had a father who could be a fisherman or could be working for the railroad or doing something else. Why wasn't he paying? I'd gone to the fact that when the situation was settled and maintenance was adjudicated by the court, then we'd attempt to collect. But it was a rather new concept, and where I was, I was fortunate because the only institution was the Little Ridley Home, which I welcomed. And the person in charge was a very fine person. So I used that as a base source and developed the foster home program up and down the Queen Charlotte Islands and throughout the interior. Inadvertently, because I had no other resource.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked.
How long did you stay in that job?
Oh, 2 years. And then I was brought down to Victoria as assistant to Mr. Creighton, who was superintendent of welfare.
Mm-hmm.
And I was his assistant until that was in the fall of 39, I guess. And in the spring of 40, the head of the relief department, which was under labor, and that department did many things from land settlement to work programs, training. And the provincial secretary's department made an agreement with the relief department and lent me to the relief department to go up to a place called Burns Lake in the interior, about halfway between Prince George and Prince Rupert, to take a look at a land area which could be used and was being assessed for the settlement of people from the drought areas in the prairie. Now, although the worst of the drought, I would say, was over, there were areas that obviously couldn't be farmed again the way they had been. And the government had been approached by the Saskatchewan government, and I went down there, to move a group of people who had wanted to come, and they'd come out and see the area. And they were Mennonites, very fine people. So the CNR agriculture land settlement person for BC was based in Prince George. I was based in Burns Lake. And we had a chap by the name of Rolly White, who was our surveyor. And we went to work to bring these people by the train load into the center of British Columbia and settle them. And they've all done well.
They stayed.
Yes, they stayed.
Because I know that many of those
Yep.
settlement plans didn't work.
Yeah, this one worked.
This one. How did that happen? What was your part in that as a social worker?
Well, by this time I was working for the relief department because the social work, the provincial secretary didn't have funds for this sort of thing. So I had to have money. So I was I think I was called a relief agent, I'm not too sure. Yes, I guess it was because I was paid as such. And that provided the funds for the land settlement that came out of the Department of Labor. And we gave allowances, we allotted the land, we brought the people in and let them choose their own land. It was all surveyed, they could see it, they could walk about, and then we started bringing them in with their wives, their chickens, their oat sheaves, their cattle, their horses, everything, ducks. Brought them in and unloaded them by the train. And then that was extended on to Vanderhoof, another town 100 miles east. And they came in and they were real productive people. Worked. Never seen people work like it. Cleared land. Did extremely well. They've stayed all through that North Country. They're there.
Did you find that your social work experience was any help in that job in particular?
Well, that was, yes, it was. That was a combination. I combined my agriculture with the social work.
Mm-hmm.
And can you imagine bringing a trainload of people in that didn't have some social problems after you put them down in a strange place and mixed them up and had them out building houses? So you needed the whole background of what any training you had to function. It worked. Mind you, we were working with a good group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were very cohesive, good leaders.
Was there any interaction between the Duke Forest and the Mennonites in that particular part?
No, we had no Doukhobors up there at all. No, none.
What happened after you finished the resettlement?
Well, the war was on then, so I went and joined the army. And I was in the army for a few years. All over the place. But anyway, I ended up in the infantry and got a commission was a lieutenant, and ended up in the, of all places, in the medical corps for a while, and then in the social service section. And then when the war was over, discharged, and I went back up north and opened up, reopened actually. I've been running the region, which was called Region 5. The province had been divided into 5 regions for administration.
Can I ask you a question about the social service
Yeah.
experience in the Army? Some of the people that I've talked to have had similar experience, or have, I don't know if it's similar or not, but they were doing social work while they were in the military. Were you doing social work activities then?
Only at the end, when the war in Europe had ended, and I guess the war in I was social service office in Chibouctou barracks in Halifax when the war in Europe ended. We were sorting troops then, or what was happening, we were sorting troops from Europe for the Japanese offensive. And then I was moved from there out to Little Mountain. They opened an office, social service office in Little Mountain, because this was the kickoff point. And the 6th Division was stationed or being built in Prince George. And they, as you don't know whether you know or not, the Canadian Army had five divisions, and the 6th was the strike division for the Japanese offensive. And that was in Prince George. So Little Mountain was becoming extremely busy. So I was transferred out to social service officer for Little Mountain, which was the discharge sorting center for BC.
So your work then had to do with helping people make the transition from...
Well, it was a gamut of things. This may be a bit surprising, but the greatest demand on my time for services was becoming involved with officers and men who wanted their wives and dependents brought out from England. And the Red Cross was handling this. And what was happening sometimes, there'd be delays, or the wives wouldn't come, or the letters had come in from wives saying Johnny was a Seaforth Highlander, and the Seaforth Highlanders left 7 months ago, where's Johnny? And then we'd have to go find Johnny to see what it was all about, because probably he had a wife and a couple of kids in England. And that was a great part of it. The straight counseling, very little.
Did you have any contact with people like Stuart Sutton or Ken Jacob or so on?
Stuart Sutton was my colonel.
Was he?
Yeah. My gosh, yes, he and I were great friends, actually. I ended up in his division, although I'd known him before the war. I was 81 in the Army, so you didn't go into an auxiliary service. I was an infantryman. So I couldn't transfer over to him until the war was over. The war was over in Europe, and then he had a choice. So I elected, and I saw him. He came down. I was in Halifax at the time. I don't know where I was, Ottawa or something. And I said, yes, look, I'll sign the form. I'll move over to your... I like him.
Mm-hmm.
Fine.
Yeah, I interviewed him a couple weeks ago.
Did you?
Much enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real tough, flight guy. Believe me. You ever want a colonel? And I had a lot of them. Well, I tell you, he was the best. Yeah.
So when the war was over, and did you come back to the provincial government?
Yes, they, provincial government, give the province full credit. They kept my slot open as administrator, the 5th administrator the department had up in Prince George. One I'd opened before I went away. And I went right back there.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed there until, for 18 months or so. And that covered the whole, everything north of the CPR Railroad to the Yukon.
Mm-hmm.
From the water to Alberta, from the Pacific to Alberta.
How were things different from when you had gone into the military and when you came back? Did that region change over the war years?
Yes, boomed. Airports had been built, lumber was moving, there was a general development that hadn't taken place prior to that. Big pulp mill went in Prince Rupert. The housing was a problem, although the military had spent tremendous sums of money putting housing in there, but it was still a problem. Prince George was a problem with housing. Smithers, there was a big airport, Vanderhoof Airport. Lumber mills there were, for example, the small town of Smithers, there were 300 lumber mills, small mills around it.
Mhm.
It was just the era prior to the takeover of the big companies that came in slowly but surely and bought out the little mills. But there was tremendous activity.
How did that affect your work?
It left us, and Kitimat was a big smelter, aluminum smelter was opened up, and it was hard to get at. There was no road in there, but the base was in Prince Rupert. Families were living in Terrace, which was 40 miles from Kitimat, but they had to go 100, 200 miles to get there by water, down to Rupert and back. And we found that in the development, the trailers, the shacks, families weren't really being abandoned, but they were being cramped, they were being under pressures of poor housing. Husbands away at the jobs, either on construction jobs or in the camps. And we had a lot of child welfare work to do. It was really into child welfare work. And there wasn't so much, now maybe we didn't recognize it, but maybe there wasn't so much abuse of children. Possibly they were all too busy to turn internally. What we found was wives who were just abandoned, really. Children who were being neglected, the simple fact that, on the other hand, there was so much money in some of the families. Unexpected money. They were not used to it. That the only recreation the husband and wife would probably have would be either the Legion or the beer parlor or someplace else. And the babysitter would probably be a teenager from down the street, and need to get tired as well. So we did have a lot of, you couldn't call it turmoil, but active work in connection with children in families themselves.
Mm-hmm. During that period of time, right after the war, the Japanese Canadians had been interned in 1942. Were any of those people still in the area where you were?
No, they'd a lot of them I knew prior to the war because I was in Rupert, and there were a tremendous Japanese population on the coast. They were good fishermen, good workmen. They were real hard workers. They worked in the pulp mill, for example, in Ocean Falls. They worked in the canneries. They all left. Very few came back to the North Coast after the war. A few did. Two friends of mine did. And they came in, their property long been sold, their businesses were gone. As far as they were concerned, they'd come back, I think, to probably shake hands with their friends and then go away again. Although a few stayed. It built up again. But it was nothing to do really with us at all. Not at that point.
Another event that I understand happened in 1946 was that there was new legislation that passed, a new social aid or social assistance act.
Social Assistance Act was passed.
How did that new act affect your work and what you were doing?
Well, I think possibly it consolidated a lot of things that we've been doing by leeway. And it gave us the opportunity to widen aid to women with children, for example, or women with incapacitated husbands. It consolidated our whole financial picture and laid down what we could and could not do. It was a good act and it was a good move.
I infer from what you say that prior to the implementation of this act, a lot of things were done because you had a good idea.
Yes, they were good. Like we used the Department of Provincial Secretary Act for extra funds for families Now, whether that was really outlined in legislation that way or not, there was some medium doubt. But the government of the day felt that we should have that opportunity of consolidating what was happening in taking place. Give the rules and regulations so the general public and everybody would know what they could get or could not get. And the regulations were made to it and they were published too. So if a person walked in, or if you went to an organization, or the private agencies would say, look, can you do this? We'd say, look, take a look at the act, take a look at the regulations, and then let's discuss it. Or we'd go to luncheons and speak and explain this is what's going on. This is what's happening to your tax dollar. Here's what you're supposed to be getting or not getting for. It was a good move, one of the best moves made in D.C.
Were you at all involved in the development of that legislation?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was on one of the committees that was working on the drafting. And it was, a lot of the work though was done when I was away. I was away for a few years. So a lot of that work was done. I was on the, what you'd call the end drafts in the act and in the regulations. But the man that really handled that was Charlie Lundy, Director of Welfare. He worked like mad. And Laura Holland, who was consultant of the deputy at the time, assistant deputy. And she and Mr. Lundy really did a tremendous job of starting in to write a new act and new regulations. And the rest of us sort of came in later and looked it over and thought this was excellent.
Okay. I'm wondering if there's anything more that you'd like to say about the time you spent in was it Prince George?
Prince George, yeah.
Prince George.
No, that was after the war, and I was there in 46, 47, I guess. It was a matter of consolidation we were so short-staffed, and it wasn't a matter of funds. We had the money, but we didn't have the bodies.
Okay.
The training programs, the schools of social work hadn't kept up with volume, and I guess they couldn't because a lot of people were away and gone, as you know. And the department started around what we called in-service training. And Amy Lee was the assistant director of welfare and head of personnel, and she had as her assistant in training was Bunny Mosgrove. And they set up a in-service training program, which was a dandy. It was actually to bring people in who had a background of working with people and bring them up to date with our legislation in connection with children, payments of allowances, and our general operation. And these people come up. And they saved the department because we had no one else. Now, it was a matter of juggle offices, close one office, open another, consolidate offices, bring people in, make sure that you at least had someone of a supervisory capacity if possible in each area. Maybe not each office, because that wasn't always possible. And I didn't do any social work. All I did was straight administration in that period. And then when I left there and came down here to what's called Region 2, the Lower Mainland, the City of Vancouver, Lower Mainland, it was straight administration.
Okay,
Okay, sure. Not much more to tell you. Well,
okay, when we left off, Mr. Sadler, you were just on your way back to Vancouver.
yes,
District 2.
and that was an administrative job, pure and simple. There were offices all through the Lower Mainland, right through Chilliwack. We covered up to a place called Boston Bar in the interior, and then Region 3 began. But with the city of Vancouver, which was really a region unto itself, and it was an entity unto itself, and I was very fortunate because the administrator of the city, Jim Chambers, was a very fine man, and he and I got along fine, and we could try to do the best we could with what we had. And that went on for here, 3 or 4 years. I can't quite remember now. And then the deputy minister, the first deputy minister of welfare for Canada, retired. His name was E.W. Griffith. One of the nicest men you could meet. A man of great ability. And his successor was Charlie Lundy, my old pal from the days when I lived in the Okanagan and Charlie lived in Salmon. And he became deputy minister. And the director of welfare job was thrown open, and none of us paid too much attention to it because we weren't really interested, the 5 administrators, in moving. And that included the one in Victoria. I suppose you get job satisfaction, and that's it. You like to stay with it. When time went on, and finally I decided that I'd apply. And I was made director of welfare. And that was in 1954, and then I moved to Victoria. And of course that was straight administration.
Mm-hmm.
But without a social work background, it would have been rather difficult to try and assess what to be done and what should be done. And I remained in that position for many years.
What were your responsibilities in that position? What programs were you responsible for?
I was responsible for the overall operation of programming. The superintendent of child welfare was responsible for child services. The supervisor of mothers social services, I guess I better call it, was responsible for any allowance issuing. The research division was responsible for the research. And as you went across all these divisions, my job was to bring the effort together so that we wouldn't have overlapping, so there'd be an office where there'd be a clearing place.
Mm-hmm.
So that the superintendent of child welfare said, look, there's not enough money being allotted to this type of family service that we're trying to give. I'm having too many children potentially to come into care. And we had what we call a planning council.
The Planning Council of Government?
Yes, of the department. And each department head, each divisional head, such as superintendent of child welfare, supervisor of the old age assistance board, and so on, would come together, plus the 5, but by that time 6 regional directors. So we had the field and the divisions as one planning council. And that was the planning council that we had that operated to consolidate, to review, and to make sure that the department was functioning without one division running away. In other words, we didn't want to spend all our time and all our effort in doing adoptions. We didn't want to spend all our time and all our effort doing straight family service. And we didn't want to spend all our time doing research or issuing financial assistance. It was a matter of equalization of effort. And my job was to try and keep this functioning. And the deputy minister ran the department.
One of the things that had happened in British Columbia was the generalized worker
Yes.
concept. That concept came to an end. Was phased out during some period of time. Was that the time when you were in this particular position?
Yes, it was developing. We had been operating on a generic approach to social work. We found that as the population explosion which took place in BC, that our demands were so concentrated in certain areas that we had to begin specialization. Now that specialization had really begun in the city of Vancouver and the city of Victoria, where they maintained pretty well a relief-paying agency basis because they had the Children's Aid Society, They had the Family Service Agency. They had the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. All these other various agencies to help. Whereas if you got into the Fraser Valley, or up into Prince George or Okanagan, the caseloads were smaller, the staff was smaller, and we could still maintain more a generic approach. But even then with the population, we found that what was happening, we were losing the training that some people had when it was a straight financial assistance matter. And slowly but surely, we started to develop a specialization, a person that we could bring in that could understand financial need, could understand the implications that there were social demands here too. But if it was straight financial need, the man was unemployed, his unemployment insurance had run out, we were going to carry him for 3 months. There was no use taking a person with a master's degree and saying, look after him. We'd use somebody else. Use a person with a master's degree in whatever she or he had as a specialty in that degree for what we might need in that. So this is why the generic approach slowly but surely slid away.
Not without some opposition, I understand.
Great deal of opposition. And I have some, I still have some thoughts about it. It bothered me because I grew up in the period, and Marjorie Smith's period, when are you going to do generic social work, or are you just going to go and look at people? And this was a very good question. And we found it worked. But it worked if you didn't have the burden, and we didn't at that time, of relief payments. And I'll have to use the word relief, money payments. It sounds better, let's say. And now they try to cover it called welfare payments. It's all money from public purse. And when those demands for all various types of services built up, we found we had to have specialists in certain areas. Although, I think as a social worker, the generic approach to social work, if I was out doing social work again, I'd love to have a combined caseload with everything in it. Adoptions, youth, youngsters, mothers, kids, counseling services, men whose straight money need was the only thing they had. Mm-hmm. And you get a caseload like that, and you really got something to do with.
What were some of the other issues that were coming up during that period of the mid to late 50s?
The one thing I think that was all important and is so often overlooked was the agreements made between the provinces and the Saint Laurent government in connection with payments of public assistance. When war broke out, and during the war, and the relief-giving agencies pretty well dried up, that part had pretty well gone. The people looking after were people who were disabled. They were not able to look after themselves financially, and that was part of life. And that continued. The provinces, in meetings in Ottawa, in the financial meetings, were offered, I think in all goodwill by the federal government, a percentage point basis of if the provinces would look after the few individuals that were beginning to show up in 1949, 1950, 51. The provinces would look after these people who didn't fit into unemployment insurance or anywhere else financially. Then, if the burden got beyond a certain percentage point, the federal government would begin putting in money.
This would be for the unemployable.
Unemployed.
The unemployed.
No, the unemployed. The unemployed. Or the unemployed. But it was unemployed, really, that everybody was looking at. Because there were then developing a group of people who were not holding positions long enough to gain unemployment insurance, or couldn't hold them, or become re-employed when their unemployment insurance ran out. The provinces realized that it would be a rather futile thing for the federal government to start setting up relief departments again to look after these few people. money was flowing in those days. So the agreements were signed that when the percentage point level was reached of a certain number of people needing assistance and drawing assistance, then the federal government would start putting in funds. That was the beginning of the shared programs of social assistance. It worked fine. 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, bang, and then there was unemployment. And in 1958, we had lineups in our offices all over BC.
The bottom fell of the economy.
Bottom fell. And the agreements were signed, and we had to look at it, and we had to start bringing in people. Fortunately, our in-service training had been continued, and started pumping more and more people into the offices to look after financial aid in the cities, in the rural offices. And that was the beginning of what we have now of an overall service, but it was really the beginning of the end of generic social
work. Financial restraint, I understand, became quite extensive in the late 50s, and I read somewhere that 1 out of 4 social workers were either fired or resigned in 59 and 60. Some social workers resigned and others were fired because of protesting provincial cutbacks in welfare rates. Is my memory serving me correctly on this?
I really can't remember anybody being fired. I think there may have been some. There was a movement of social workers adrift out of the BC civil service. Mm-hmm. Jobs were opening up at the federal level. The pay was better. And it was quite simple to step across the street. You could get into a different millennium, really. I don't know what you call it. And some of the programs were being promoted and expanded in the research end, and that took people that were, I know I was tempted. You did a good research. The universities were expanding, and there was a general movement. Now, I think possibly part of the movement, too, from in BC, was the fact that the offices, a lot of people felt the offices were just inundated with the unemployed. This was true. So I think there was an overall picture. It wasn't just the fact that the unemployment had become a problem and the social workers left. I think it was a whole series of situations, all within that period, say 58, 50, right up to 62, 63.
During that period of time, was there any kind of welfare rights activism going on?
Yes, there was. Yes, there was. It was spotty, it was local, but there was a definite movement, and I think probably in the forefront were the matter of poor housing, which began, and as the price of housing had moved up, and the allowances certainly had moved up, the demand on people who were on some type of allowance became pretty critical, because more and more of their income would be going for straight maintenance, which is rent. And groups became active, consolidated. We began to deal with them. I know I was beginning to deal with them on the administrative level. And I always felt, and I know Charlie Lundy felt, that we better sit down and talk with these people. At least we must know what's there so we could report it. Mm-hmm. Then if the politicians wouldn't do anything about it, then at least the people knew where they could go to find surcease or help. Mm-hmm. And as time went on into the 60s, there developed poverty groups that I worked very closely with some of them. I found that by sitting down with them, we could work through, try something, and let them know if this wasn't going to work, if they didn't have enough, if they had to do something, it had to be at a political level. There was no use stamping into the offices and tearing the places apart. That wasn't going to change anything. If they were going to do anything, they were going to do it politically. Go and see some of their MLAs. And I had friends in all parties, so I could say that quite truthfully. Because I've never been a politician, never had to do it. And in that way, I think some of the organizations began to see that they must consolidate their own efforts. If they were going to have a voice, there were no use having 5 or 6 people with a wee squeaky voice. They'd better get together and try and solve some of their own problems. And believe me, they did. The co-ops, cooperative housing, in rental searches, this sort of thing.
You were director of welfare for what period of time?
Oh, must have been 20 years. I had 2 or 3 different titles, but I was director of welfare, assistant deputy minister, and deputy minister, and that covered a period from 1954 to 1976.
And you retired in 1976?
Yes, I retired early. I shouldn't say that, but I did.
You already told us your birthdays.
That's right, too.
To go back then, not quite as far as we were in the late 50s, but during the, I guess it would be during the early 60s, there was some more developments at the federal level, which would have affected, I assume, welfare payments and social services, and the development of Canada Assistance Plan, and some other federal legislation. Were you all involved in that?
Yes. Yeah, I was on those committees. Yeah. The Canada Assistance Plan just followed up to the agreements made with the Saint Laurent government. That was just an extension. That was the next step in the Canada Assistance Plan on sharing of payments, which really went back to the old sharing of relief payments of the 30s, based on the same thing. It used to be, 80, 20, 60, 40, 40, 40, and so on. And these payments were on a 50-50 basis. The yellow paper, the work was done, it was committee basis. I was on one of those committees for a long time with, it was before Brian Iverson's time. Brian came in later, hopefully he was ahead of it. I'm trying to think of the deputy's name, the federal deputy prior to Johnson. Doesn't matter. He was a research man, economist. But those agreements were worked out, and they were very workable, and they were very essential. And when the provinces made that agreement with the federal government, there's going to be a sharing. Then again, like our Social Assistance Act, there had to be a range of points listed as to what you did or what you didn't do. And it was a forward movement in Canada. It was a good one. It worked. We never had any trouble with it. We were one of the few provinces that never had any trouble. We had federal government auditors. I did something that astonished a lot of people. I made an office space for the federal government auditors. Instead of having them up the street in Victoria, guys, come down here so we can talk to you and you can talk to us. And it was kind of a strange, odd situation, beginning, I guess, but it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened. Because there was something wrong with the voucher or something there. The man stepped next door, down the hall, and he said, look, you can't do this. This is not shareable. Instead of festering along for months, it was settled. And then we didn't do it again, or they didn't do it again. For a long time.
Good working relationship.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah. We always had a good working relationship with the federal government.
Also, during that period of time, a little later, I guess, still along the line of federal-provincial relations, there came to be a number of constitutional discussions, one of which took place in Victoria and had to do with where social welfare was discussed. Were you at all involved in the 1971 conference?
Yeah, I was there.
What happened there?
Well, it's quite a document that was written up. And the basis of what could take place or transpire in Canada in the social service field. That was followed up by the establishment of two types of meetings. Actually, it was three, I guess. The ministers of welfare of the provinces of Canada established a meeting basis of once a year when they were going to bring forth their agenda of what they felt should be looked at, should be discussed, or was needed. They didn't say in conjunction with meetings with the federal government, but it was underlying thought was there. There's no use discussing it amongst ourselves, what was the use anyway. And it was an interesting concept, I think possibly. I don't know whether it's still functioning, I don't think so, maybe. For example, if Quebec was the host province, BC would run the meeting and produce the agenda in conjunction back and forth throughout the province. See what I mean? Or BC was the host, then it could be Saskatchewan that would run the meeting and provide the agenda and all.
Mm-hmm. So shared responsibility.
Share responsibility. Yeah. Those meetings, excuse me, I felt were productive because what it did was make each province realize that they weren't alone either with their problems or their non-problems. And there were situations that were germane to just one province, could be Ontario, could be BC. And why take the time of a provincial, federal meeting for one area that could be discussed unilaterally? And this was, to me, the big thing. Well, in the other meetings at that time, under the direction of Mr. Lalonde, the ministers met with the federal minister on a continuing basis. The ministers delegated to their deputies areas which they wanted explored, discussions papers prepared and brought forward. We started in with a guaranteed income. And boy, I tell you, we worked our hearts out for 3 years on that. And we met about every 2 or 3 months, the deputies. Anywhere. Toronto, St. John's, different province. And subcommittees. And I was getting to the point I was going back and forth to Ottawa and back east about once every 6 weeks. But it was fascinating work. And I really believe that we had in our hands, in the hands of the ministers, a basic income plan for Canada. Now, mind you, there was a notch in it, there had to be, when you hit a certain income level. And inflation hit. And what we were looking at, I got to be careful here. Could you cut off from it? I may be telling you things that I shouldn't be. No, I won't tell you any more about this. Well, anyway, you can start again. I'll just say this. When inflation came in and started to increase in Canada, we had to re-look at costs.
Sure.
And the cost factors were such that there was all levels of government had to stop and reassess what they might be doing in regard to a guaranteed income.
To help me get some context on this, was this in relationship to the development of the Social Services Act and then subsequently the Social Services Financing Act, 75, 76,
Yeah.
and 77? So these are the discussions to which you're alluding.
Yes, these are the discussions. What we were looking at, to put it on a broad plane, was to have a basic income established in Canada so that you wouldn't have allowances of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
There'd be a wipeout of social assistance, some areas with their mother's allowances, Department of Veterans Affairs, and so on and on and on and on, and all the different types of allowances in pay. That you'd have a basic income that no one would fall beneath. And therefore, all other types of allowances, workman's compensation, they know, would not be necessary. And what you'd have would be a transference of funds already being spent in various allowances that would become part of the basic payment to every person, man, woman, and child in Canada.
What party of the British Columbia government would have been in power then?
So, Craig. So, Craig.
And your minister would support the idea of guaranteed income. That's so good.
Well, I don't know whether it was a matter of whether he would support it, because I couldn't quote him, I don't know. But it was a matter that he wanted to know what this meant. Every minister, give every minister in Canada, from the federal government down, full credit, they wanted to know what they were all looking for. Of course, I can't quote them too, I don't know what they were looking for. But anyway, basically what people wanted to know was what would be a cost factor to stabilize the income basis of every Canadian, which meant be a stabilization in the economy. You know exactly where the money came from, where the money went. And you'd get rid of bureaucracy that is beyond belief. And we counted in the money everything from payments to Indians, to payments to mothers, to payments of veterans allowances and all of it.
Was it inflation that was the factor that put the kibosh on that idea?
Maybe there was some change in philosophy too. See, inflation, when you got into inflation, you got into the expenditure of funds in donors, gigantic in the way it increases over what we've been looking at. And maybe at the same time, there was a more conservative approach in all thinking that it was premature. But in any case, it hasn't developed. And when those meetings ended, I don't know what took place after, because shortly after that I retired. And I still think it was a good idea.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a better understanding, or not only from my own understanding, but of how what sounds like such a progressive philosophy, a progressive idea, what could have happened to make such what sounds like a 180 turn.
Then it suddenly died?
Trying to think of an understanding of that in more people now who are trying the idea of a guaranteed income is kind of like a ambulance. Floats through the air and once in a while.
I don't know whether it'll ever go.
Yeah. During the time that you were deputy minister, I wanted to ask you a question about the role of a senior civil servant in promoting social good. How did you do your work, and how did you try and make things better?
I think it was interpretation at the maybe political level. We had good working. When I was director of welfare for years, we had a deputy minister, Rickinson, who was a real fine chap. My boss, I was assistant deputy to him. And he had a good relationship with politicians. So did I. And he was the overall, he operated the department, operated well. And in dealing on he knew more about finances than any other man I'd ever met. And he could sit down with the Minister of Finance and just say, here it is. And that worked nicely. I could sit down with politicians of all stripes and try and explain what we either needed or didn't need. And if it was feasible, sometimes it would be supported. If it wasn't feasible financially, it wouldn't be supported. But we didn't find that we were brushed aside. We were listened to. And I think that Rickinson, the deputy, he had an excellent relationship with the Premier, and they could talk finance. I think that helps.
Mhm.
But of course, we were caught up, like all departments of, let's call it, welfare, everywhere, that there were so many demands on government funds that we had to just get what we could get. And sometimes, and quite often, none of us were happy about what we got because we wanted more. We always felt that if we had more, we could do a better job and probably help people to help themselves in such a fashion that we would not see them again as a department. But we took what we got and tried to explain what was happening with what we had and carried on. But we were criticized, of course. And we were always being quoted or misquoted. You meet the press or someplace else. Yeah, but we got good coverage.
Mhm.
I always found the press was very fair to us. The press understood that we were civil servants and who they had to talk to really were the ministers. But they'd use us for references.
Did you use your phone?
Reference. Try stories out on us. They'd pick up a story and they'd try that for background. Sometimes it was extremely interesting.
Anything come to mind about that?
No.
Okay. I'd like to move now to some general questions and sort of reflective questions as you think back over your career. One I wanted to ask you about involvements that you might have had with the professional association over the years. Canadian Association of Social Workers or the BC Association.
Gwen Lundy and I guess, are two of the oldest members. We've often discussed, I'd forgotten when I joined. I couldn't join when I graduated because in agriculture I'd only carried one language and I needed two languages and I had to pick one up. Well, the last thing I was going to do was stick around university for another 6 months to pick up a language when I was finished. I think our fieldwork finished at the end of August, and we wrote the government entrance exams sometime September. And then I went to work on September the 15th. So I had to let my French go or whatever it was. Well, then I picked it up during my travels in the winter to Salon or sociology, I've forgotten now. So anyway, I think I joined around 1940, or 39, I guess it was.
Mm-hmm.
And Gwen was about the same time because we talked. I've always felt, and I've always remained a member, and for one very good reason. I feel that social workers have to be recognized as a profession. And unless social workers have an organization which is vocal, which is strong, which is understanding, they never will be. And I get quite annoyed sometimes in times of stress and trouble and so on, that people will say, oh, well, the BCASW or CASW hasn't done anything for us. I'll quit paying my fees. I think a most negative thing. Get in there and dig a little harder. And sure, we take our lumps with it, but what's the difference?
Mm-hmm.
And I've always felt that it's been a positive thing, CASW and then BCASW.
Mm-hmm. You've been involved with them in committees and activities and
Oh, yes, not in the last few years I've got away. Well, I did before I left Victoria. I was working on some of the committees. And prior to that, when I was in Vancouver, I was president for a couple of years. 1 or 2 terms. And it was very enjoyable. And we had movement. We did things. We were active. Good group.
Were you involved in the association when the BC Association separated in 1956?
Not too much. I was in Victoria at the time, and I was moving back and forth. I was trying to keep an eye on a job over here, over there, and in that time, I didn't really have anything to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
On the separation.
Another question I wanted to ask you in relation to that is, comfortable?
It's okay, his coat was bent under it.
What it has meant to you to be a social worker, you to call yourself.
I'd do it again. You bet. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. When I went out in the field, no one knew what a social worker was. Of course, I don't think we did either. And I'd tell everybody I was a social worker, and this is what I did. You know, proud of it. I'd go and make speeches to all these organizations. Because if you were going to be something, you had to be it, and be a good one. No, I'd be a social worker all over again. I'd do it all over again, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Sure. Yeah.
Good for you.
Oh, I had her ups and downs, believe me, but and I do a lot of things differently. But I do it again.
And a final question that I wanted to ask you is about your accomplishments over your career. Things that you're particularly proud of.
Gosh, that's a most difficult question. I think one thing with it that I feel I have some feelings about was bringing together and helping to bring together. I didn't do it myself. Various sections, branches, divisions into what we used to call the welfare field service or the welfare department, welfare section and then department. I think it strengthened social work. There was too much division, too many little pieces. Now that can be strength in itself because you get many voices. But on the other hand, there is the possibility of division and conquering too. And I feel a consolidation of social work in the Department of Social Service was a good thing. And some of us felt that way and we worked for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of the things that, now I know there are people that will say that was the worst thing that ever happened to social work in BC. I just don't agree with that. I think that we needed a consolidated vocal front. Not only as a department, but as a BCASW. That's social work.
And you're pleased to have all.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, is there anything you'd like to add, Mr. Savage, that we haven't talked about?
No, I think I've, I was at it for so long, there's so many things, but I think I covered pretty well. Oh, it wasn't boring.
For me?
Yeah,
Oh, no, not at all.
because it's all brand new to you.
No, it was really interesting, and I really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll wait till he cuts it off and then I'll clear my throat. Thank you.
Just at the time we
Yeah, I ran out of
too.
you. I don't know how much.